Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the session this afternoon. This is being recorded, so if you have colleagues that didn't get a chance to attend that would benefit from the content, please let them know. They can get it on the secured YouTube channel that you guys will have access to. If anybody has a question or a comment during the course of the discussion here, please just raise your hand. We'll direct a microphone around to you. This is being recorded, so you'll have to use the microphone to get it picked up. Okay, so the session is exploring the gap between security system design and successful operation. I'm personally very interested in this topic. When it was posed to me by Ray, I kind of scratched my head for a second. I thought about it, and it's something I've been interested in a long time. So hopefully we'll get some answers today from the audience and our panel. And our panel today consists of Jim Francis. He is President and Chief Consultant of LFJ Consulting. Thank you for joining us, Jim. Tom McCoig, he's the Manager of Industrial Security Solutions for ABS Group. And Mark Powers is the Site Security Leader for Catalent Pharma Solutions. So we have a panel consisting of two consulting practitioners and a consumer of consulting and security technology. So this should be very interesting. Okay, so here's the full session description, just to kind of set us up. Security system design aims to match designers' best ideas of security technology and product solutions to the perceived client needs and security risks. However, in practice, for many, successful operation remains an elusive result. Why? Is there too much technology? Is there an inadequate user skill set? Or are those who manufacture, design, and install such systems not taking steps to ensure they will operate as intended? So we're going to discuss this important issue with the experts, both from the design and the client side. Now, one of the things that I have through the course of the discussion is there are some online polls. So if you want to participate in the poll, go ahead and take your phone out and open up your web browser and go to BRC, my initials, .participole.com. You'll see it on the next slide here. And we have our first poll. I just kind of want to get a gauge for how many of you think that this is a problem in practice with systems that are designed, deployed? There's a disconnect between the intended security system design, the technology capability, and what actually occurs in practice. So again, please go to brc.participole.com and you will see 6 buttons. It will look like this, and you pick the button that aligns to your answer. So the question here is, security system design aims to match designers' best ideas of security technology and product solutions to the perceived client needs and security risks. However, in practice, for many, successful operation remains an elusive result. So how big of an issue is this? Choice number 1, that's A, that aligns to A. Not a problem at all. All systems use all the features as intended by the designer. Choose B if you think this affects about 20% of systems. C if you believe it affects 40% of systems. D if it's 60%. E for 80%, and F, all systems have some feature that is designed but not utilized as intended. So let's get a gauge of what people think is the nature of this issue, and give an extra second here. Okay, we've got 8 responses, so I'm going to go ahead and show the results. 9 responses. Okay, it looks like there's a pretty significant distribution here, but with quite a concentration on F. So it appears as though people think that this is a common problem. Of course, F is all systems have some feature that is designed but not utilized as intended. So let's go into this issue in a little more detail. I'm going to ask a question of the panel here. And Jim, I think we'll start with you, if that's okay. So how big of an issue do you think this is? Are systems commonly overspecified? And if so, what percentage of users use their system as originally envisioned by the design team? How involved is the end user in the design process? And if users aren't using the system as designed, is that part of the disconnect as you see it?
I think there's a major disconnect between what may have been intended in the design and what gets either operationally deployed or operationally utilized. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is lack of training, because the training that we specify typically in our documentation that goes out to bid requires what is manufacturer orientation on those devices that are installed. So the VMS person will come in and say, these are the buttons you push to get video recorded. These are the buttons you push to affect some kind of a video search, and then the access control system will be taught, and this is how you get to enter into a cardholder database, and this is how you achieve information historically from the system. But the real purpose and intent of the system is never conveyed by that integrator or by that manufacturer training, because in fact they may not have even understood the threats or the conditions that drove that design. And so the first thing that all of us can do is much better define what are the threats that we're trying to counter with the designs we're producing. How did we intend the system that we're designing to counter those threats? And how can we best train the people who are ultimately going to be sitting behind the console or whatever on how to effectively utilize it?
Tom, did you have anything to add to that?
First, I would have a question of the audience, and that would be, let's define end user. Because an end user to me is probably different than what it is to a design build team. So anybody care to pitch in what your definition of an end user would be?
Well, I'd like to go back to Tom. The first part was, before we do any type of security design, we have to do a security analysis of the premise. So we would know who the end user is. What is their market? What are they involved? I mean, manufacturing got a definitely different use than a hospital. So you have to do an assessment of vulnerability. And I don't like to use the word threat, but that's what as is, and everybody's recognizing threat and vulnerability assessments first to determine what the design is, and then what is the protection what are you protecting? What is your vulnerabilities? What is your assets? And that defines what the end user is.
The question I would have, the question I would have back to that would be, who is it, an engineering team that is doing the gap analysis or the threat assessment, or is it a team of security practitioners that have been there, done that, worked midnight shifts, have seen how these facilities operate?
Well,
and I just like, I think
answer
this is
to
a
your
good
question,
discussion.
somewhere in the owner's decision, they needed to decide that they needed a professional, whether it's a integrator or a design consultant or an architect who's designing a building for them. We do a lot of work with the architects, and the architects bring us on board to do for PSAPs or for prisons or whatever, and we do the vulnerability assessments and make the recommendations. So the owner determines somewhere along the line that they wanted somebody to have input on their security. There's many times where we have owners go, give me this, give me that. And then we have to explain to them, if you design your security and we document it for you, then you own the liability. If you hire a consultant to design your security and he has to do the vulnerability and the assessment, well, then the consultant owns that liability just as well as the integrator. If the integrator takes it upon himself and says, well, I'm an expert because I know smoke detectors go in the ceiling, well, then he owns the liability. So it's really the owner made the decision what level of involvement does he need to get the adequate security, and then he hires the appropriate group, and I'm in a consulting firm, so we get hired a lot to do that. And that's where we start. We start with a vulnerability assessment before we do anything else, before we make a recommendation. Then we meet with the client and say, this is what we saw, this is what we understand, are we on the right path?
I'd like to answer that question a little bit differently. In two,
I think that was on.
Sorry. The simple answer to that question is the operational stakeholder is our client, regardless of how many layers are above us. Whether there's a general contractor, an architect, procurement, our end user ultimately becomes the operational stakeholder that uses the systems. So everything we design against is for that group.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of clear up the terminology, and this gentleman can go next, but the term, in a room like this, the terminology means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so my definition of end user on the consulting side of things, helping with like a corporate audit or going into an industrial facility or a hospital or whatever type of, 10 substations in the Midwest or whatever. So it's a different set of terminology, I think, from the engineering side of things to the practitioner. side of things sometimes, so we get our terminology confused. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and agree with what was just said back there. Typically, the end user I typically get winds up being the director of security or the CTO or CIO, and it's not the right end user in most cases. What I need is the operations manager that's running the AOC and running the EOC, and they're on night shifts when things go wrong and on weekends, because they have a very different view of what that system should be doing at the end of the day than their C-level management does. But typically I wind up having to almost fight to get to that audience.
Well, if you were going to redo a video management system and a CCTV system, say like at a large chemical facility, 500, 750 acre, 1,000 acre chemical facility, and they've got a legacy system that's 20 years old, there's a lot of work to be done. And a lot of times they don't want to pay for all the infrastructure improvements that need to be done. They want to go to the end point and replace the cameras with the infrastructure that they've had. At least that's what I see from the consulting world side of things. But this gentleman used the term vulnerability assessment. We're using different terms. I'll explain what it means to me and then see if we all come to that. On the consulting side of things, on the operational risk consulting side of things, a vulnerability assessment or a gap analysis or helping with a corporate audit or something like that at a very high level, so we don't take too much time on this topic, would be this to me: understanding what their written procedures are, understanding how they use their existing measures practically on a day-to-day basis on all 3 shifts, if it's a 24-hour operating facility, and even if it's not. And then one of the most important factors there is the manpower, the security manpower, whether it's an operations center guy or gal that's making $20, $25 an hour, or is it a security manpower vendor at $11 an hour? Okay, and then the training piece of it, and then if there's a compliance issue like CFATS, MITSA, DEA, or whatever, okay, because all those things matter in an auditing or a vulnerability assessment standpoint. So, Frank, you've done this. Are they doing what they have written down? Are they using the technology that they currently have effectively? Does the manpower know what they're doing?
No, there's always a huge disconnect between
Yeah.
initial assessment, because that all gets forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's a problem.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Hey, Mark, if you could comment on your experience as a consumer of systems, does the design match how it's actually utilized? Is the design intended for the operators, the operational stakeholders of the system? And then also, could you comment on if operations change over time and the design doesn't keep pace with the new needs?
Well, thank you very much. First, I want to say I don't want your jobs. I've spent 3 days here and got a much greater appreciation for what you do, so thank you very much. Second, I need to put the disclaimer out there that I'm only speaking as myself. I don't speak on behalf of my company. I think I was invited here because I've got 30 years of design experience, probably $100 million of actual capital projects, and that's all security. That doesn't include anything else. Most of my design efforts have been primarily in manufacturing, so I can give you that background. I have done some high-rise design when I was with Arthur Andersen in Chicago, so I've done some work in that very code-heavy environment as well. So from my perspective, what happens with a design, and I will represent, I'll also be honest, there's some people out there who have consulted with me. I apologize for my behavior during those consulting engagements right now. I can be a bit of a, I guess over 30 years, you kind of, you know the mistakes you've made, and you're trying to make sure you don't get those mistakes repeated. So, so I'm a little heavier involved in the design discussion. The way I come across from it is just the way it's been described here. I'm looking at vulnerability assessment, especially if you're dealing with food or pharmaceutical. And vulnerability to me is where can someone put something into my product that's going to damage my brand, my shareholder value, put us out of work, right? The second thing I have to balance my designs with is the operation. What I've learned in my career is I can have all the smartest people around looking at a schematic or a blueprint. At the end of the day, they don't understand it. I've been too many jobs where the walls have gone up, the card readers have come in, and some operations manager said, well, that's not how we're going to use the room, right? So that becomes one of the more difficult challenges. The second is because of the life cycle of some of these projects, we'll go out and we'll spec a card access system or a camera system wanting all the bells and whistles, and then all of a sudden we don't need all those bells and whistles anymore. So those items go dormant. I think the other thing is these systems become so intelligent and so layered that I don't understand all the layers that are there that I can use, right? And God only knows that the guards have even more difficult time understanding everything they can use. I made a point here earlier, and some will agree or disagree. What I see in Project Life on my end is everybody's worried about that front end cost, right? What's it going to cost? What's it going to cost? And I'm the one who raises my hand, and I'll say, well, wait a second, what about the training? Right? Because we got to put this in and we got to train people, because I may know it backwards and forward because I'm probably the person who went out and really did all the work, but that poor operator, when they get in their hands, doesn't understand it, right? And so at midnight, someone made that point here, at midnight, that poor guard may not know there's something in there that could save their butt at midnight or help the business get saved. So training often gets pushed out. I don't know if you see that as well. The other thing we see is no one's thinking about service and maintenance on this stuff. So many people think that electronic security systems are fire and forget systems. You put them in and they work forever. If anyone's ever worked at any manufacturing plant, you know the day you go in is the day it gets busted, right? And who pays for that, right? So you got to talk about that in the contractual terms. And then someone mentioned here the life cycle of that equipment. Who's managing that? Because I don't care what folks are telling you out there, manufacturers, at some point those cameras will fail, right? You got boards that fail, so you have to start thinking about that. So it's a long way of answering the question that what I have found also over time is if you stick with a system, you get to know the system better, and then you get to know more of the things you could use, right? Not underutilized.
I'd like to address the training issue. I come from a correctional background. So the people.
Before you do that, can I just add one point? This morning, I don't know how many of you were able to attend the gentleman in the back in his session on weaponizing our systems. But one of the things that came clearly to me in that session, since we've so focused on this term end user, who is the end user? Is the end user the guy sitting in the control room as you talked about? Or is it the responding police officer who's trying to get situational intelligence in an active shooter situation? So we have multiple end users, and it's important for us in our design thought and process to identify all of those potential end users so that, as he mentioned in his presentation, video was delayed from being able to get a stream of video to review for 20 minutes because of the way the system was configured. It was therefore impossible for the emergency responders to get a real-time analysis of what was going on and how best to enter that facility. So as we're designing things, it's important for us not to be constrained in our thought of what that term end user is, but to explore all the potential end users who may benefit from that system.
And I agree with you. That's exactly coming from a correctional perspective. You know, the client was the sheriff. Okay, we needed to maintain the security of the facility. But the end user was the officer sitting in a control room that doesn't have that level of sophistication. So we would have to design, we use very sophisticated electronics to operate the correctional facility, but had to design the interface, the human interface, at a level that the user could easily use. So even today, you know, if we're not doing correctional, we're doing airports or something, we still look at, you know, what is the owner, who, the TSA, the CBP and all that. And then we also look at who interfaces with that system. And then that platform is designed to allow the user, that person, that user, to be able to operate it efficiently, to give and say, hey, give me a recording. He can, 2 icons on a screen and it's printing out a picture. So it does take various levels of design, and there are various users, but when you say end user, my stakeholder, the person who's paying the bills and is actually saying this is what I want, he's the ultimate end user for us. We have various levels of users after that, policy, procedure, and then technology.
Yeah, and when I'm designing a system, and those who have been with me and have worked with me, I take end user from the operator on the floor level. It has to be KISS level. So there's no question as to what the badge reader is. There's no question about what a blue colored emergency release does. There's no question about all the other devices. So at the end user that user comes up, they know how to operate the door. I also have what I've seen different in the last 15, 20 years is when I first started this business and got into this business, I was kind of left alone to go to a room to design a system, right, and select the system. Nobody wanted it. That was kind of like a little secret area. What I have seen in the last 15 years, thanks to various TV shows, is there's so many people involved in the design of a security system now. Everyone's got their 2 cents, and I think it overburdens the system at the end of the day. They've not made it a KISS, keep it simple. I call it KISM, keep it simple for Mark. If I can understand, anybody can understand it. But that's, I think, what also is happening. There's too many hands in the pot in this process now for everybody. And then at the end of the day, we've got add-ons, tag-ons that my other end user, which is the guards, they don't understand why we have this stuff. And then what happens is from the damage side is if we get an alarm, the guards are thinking they're false, right? Because they don't understand why this is on there. And I'll fight tooth and nail, for example, a hang-on, like the maintenance group may want to put a sensor on a boiler, right? Tie it into my badge access system. Now, where does that fall in, right? Right? But now that's my end user in the corporation because he or she's my customer. So now I have to figure out the way to make it foolproof for the guard because they don't understand what a boiler is and what it means to the business. That when they get that alarm, they can literally follow step by step by step. And Tom has brought out a great point, and I saw this happen Friday when I was leaving to Florida to come up here. If a guard isn't familiar with an event, right? And I'll give you a real life scenario that happened at a company I was at. If the guards are in the security operations center on the cameras and they are watching 5 people break in the back door of a warehouse with guns and are holding other guards down while they're stealing oxycodone, and the guard, all they realize is that the alarm comes up, do this because we've got a breach, and all they do is press the duress alarm and don't follow the other 15 steps. And the reason why is they just froze. They never saw anything like this before. So, that's an underutilized system, so a little bit of training.
Okay, last
One
comment,
quick
please.
thing.
Yeah, please.
So in the correctional, we had instructional menus to do just that.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So we are getting off to quite a start here. Let's do one more poll and see where we're at in the audience. So again, if you didn't participate in the first poll, take out your phone, go to your web browser and go to brc.participole.com. And the question here is, what is the primary source of the problems, the disconnect between the design and the use of the system as it was intended? So answer number 1 aligns with button A, so lack of consumer involvement in design process. B is training. C, consumer ability to follow the procedures on event. D, testing to ensure the security events are detected or prevented by the technology. E, reliance on technology integration, which may break on version changes. Or F, installer implementation of design. So we'll give it another second here, see if we get some more answers that come in. Okay, let's take a look at the results. Okay, so we have a heavy focus on training. Training was definitely identified as the primary source of the disconnect. Lack of involvement with the consumer in the design process. This is interesting. We just had such a big discussion about who is the end user. I use the term consumer throughout this presentation. So, even if you're involved with the consumer, the procurer of the system, you may not be identifying the end user or the end users of the system. So, very interesting. Okay, get another question here. I'm going to target Jim for this, if you don't mind. Is it common for a target technology to lose out in the bid process, which may affect how successfully the system is operated as designed? Do you intend to have a particular technology and or a particular set of features that don't ultimately get accomplished because consumer selects a bid that doesn't perfectly match the design?
We all shudder at the term value engineering. And so often our great design philosophy and intent gets caught up in the last minute scramble to look for bucks. And often what we've got to do is do the best we can with the money we've got to spend. So it somewhat goes back to Tony's perspective on that when you've identified the threats and you've done truly a security master plan for your client as part of your job, you're then able to quantify for them how much it's going to mean to your program to minimize that particular system. And it's an important factor that we often lose because they want to think of it in terms of return on investment, they want to think of it in terms of, overall cost of the project, but the overall cost to them can go back to what we heard this morning, again in the weaponizing session, that you can suffer great liability as a designer, as an end user, and as an implementer of the system if in fact you chose, for budget, for whatever other reasons, to eliminate a device, a system, a feature for money, when in fact that feature ultimately can be so exploited by the bad guy that the bad event now puts us all in a litigation vulnerability.
Yeah, one comment back there.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but there should be a differentiation between projects because you're talking about vulnerability assessment, this and that. There's a lot of different projects, and a lot of the projects, that's not a part of it. There isn't. Yeah, I do high-end residential in New York City that, millionaires living in these parts. They don't do that. Again, it's a best guess. You have to use your experience standards and things like that to determine, the security you provide. When you talk about the liability before, my thing is that you have to design based on your experience, industry standards, to the best of your ability, and then let them VE it out. You can state your argument all you want, but at the end of the day, but what you have as yours protection is, it was there, you took it out. You know what I mean? Now, you argue, obviously, I'm not saying you don't advocate for your design, but at the end of the day, we don't have control over that as designers. So you have to be your best advocate, fight for the things, but get it in writing. That's it. I always get it in writing. What they, okay, please explain.
Good point, because I was just going to ask the floor, how do you protect your butt from that situation? Because if you are complicit in that elimination, you're complicit.
Yes, and there's no way around it. No.
How many of you have taken disclaimers that said this was not implemented as designed?
Just 2 weeks ago. All the time. I don't have the conversation, then I'll write up the reasoning, and then as a last straw, it's okay. This is what I'm telling you should do because of.
Actually, I don't do a disclaimer.
Yeah.
I actually just assign the risk back to the client who did the value engineering and said, by your direction, we don't recommend it. This is the things, this is violates your policy procedure you advised us of, and you run it now.
Okay. Let's take another look at this. So is it common, Tom, this is for you, is it common for the deployment team to configure the system or deploy in a way other than how it was intended to be designed, and does that affect the disconnect? Did we lose the...
Well, I would view that question on the operational end of things, that if there were changes made during the installation process and things like that, somebody needs to know about it, and I'm sure that's all communicated. That's probably not the best question for me. I'm more on the other end of it. I will say this though, is when we're deploying and designing a system, to me there's three things the one thing that comes into play, getting a little bit off the subject here, but is that we design these systems around attack scenarios that we think are feasible. A lot of times I'm afraid we're not taking a scenario-based approach. We may be, they may be, but we're not taking necessarily a scenario-based approach towards systems design. In other words, how the attacker or the aggressor or whoever you're dealing with here, a trespasser, is actually going to carry out what they do. I mean, we've all got to admit that a good part of the physical security industry is rather mundane. It's the day-to-day operation of letting people in and letting people out. And then when events happen, many times we're caught off guard. And then we only find out the effect of the systems design once it gets tested by some type of event or something like that. Mark?
Again, I'd like a show of hands. How many of you have actually sat in a command center with a $12 an hour guard for any length of time? If you haven't, wow, great number of hands. If you're not doing that, you're not effectively dealing with that lowest common denominator.
So staying on the thread with this question, in my experience, has been the deployment of your system is really only as good as the integrator's technician. Is really what it fundamentally comes down to. And building a relationship with them, medium-sized projects, large projects, it doesn't matter. But if the technician that's doing the work doesn't have a clear understanding of the design intent, then things can go off on a tangent because it's going to be their interpretation, because most of these systems have so many different ways of skinning a cat, they're going to skin it their way. And then when you're going into commission and test and kind of do kind of a post-mortem on how things are looking, you find a whole myriad of things that were never really part of the design or not required, and they went over and above and did other things because they felt it was necessary, when really it makes things more complicated for that lowest common denominator, or it added a level of complexity that was not part of the project, and the integrator is yelling at the project level, well, why are we over budget on this? So I always try to have a very good relationship with, at the integrator's lowest denominator, which is the technician, and getting them on board of what we're trying to do. So this way there's no surprises, and it helps make that expectation of what we're looking to accomplish and what we've essentially laid a foundation and an expectation to whoever the end user is or the consumer.
How many of you have ever been on a project where the installation project manager has never even seen your spec?
Oh, right, that's, I mean, we call it contract documents for a reason. I don't care if the integrator is on board with me. He has a contract. That's what the contract is.
I got to mic everybody, yeah. No. Okay. Try to, if you're going to speak for any length of time, just try to grab the microphone so it gets recorded. Thank you.
Right. And on this point, I guess, and it goes back to the layers of systems that get tied in. I mean, of course, it's not an access system or video system. I mean, there's a myriad of systems now that are all being integrated. And what I typically run into is the contractor's really good at one of those, right? They're really good at the access, really good at the VMS. But to meet the intent of the system as I designed it requires the actual integration. and that's where they seem to fall short, for me at least. They have issues in those details, and of course devil's in the details, and the real intent is that integration. So that's where I typically see them having challenges.
So if I can take a second, let me echo some words that Joe said back there. I think the key to a lot of this is the technician. The better the tech, the better the job. The tech who, and also the tech who understands that there's a professionalism to this, right? And they want to do it right, and they want to have a standard and do it. Versus a tech who's working for his integrator, and the sole purpose is to make the profit margin bigger than it needs to be or should be, because they undersize the profit job. So in my case, to answer the question, I've had a deployment where the engineering team changed the size of a vault. They actually shrunk it, but never bothered to tell anybody they shrunk it to save money. And we discovered we had a problem when the design of the electronic system wasn't lining up correctly, and we thought it was us. And then we brought in a $50,000 cage to put in the vault, and the $50,000 cage couldn't fit. Wow. Right? And then finally somebody admitted. But that's an example. The tech on that job knew it was wrong, but never said anything about it, right? Because it's not my problem. I've had another tech who will immediately tell me that they've changed something in the field and come forward, and then it's not a big deal to make that change. Another place where, and I'm under pressure to deliver on time just like you are, right? On time, on budget. We've committed to some customer, we're gonna make something, do something, it's gonna be there. And the Lord only knows we don't wanna be the ones holding that up, right? So I've been on jobs where we go out and we start looking at conduit. And we realize that they've bought smaller size conduit to save them a dollar a stick, right? And then now what do I do, right? Because you didn't do it to contract, right? So do I say, whoops, you got to go and place all that conduit that's now full of cable, right? Or do I just live with it and accept it and we try to deal with it some other ways? Now, by the way, the long-term effect on that project is they scored the wire when they pulled the wire through their conduit, right? So I got false alarms galore. Someone in this room was trying to do an acceptance up to 3 in the morning to accept that system, all because someone decided to save $1 on a stick of conduit, right? So yeah, so I've run into those deployment situations
So
all
to
the
your
time.
point, and to your point, where you want to form a relationship with the integrator, how do you do that when it's public sector money and you have to competitively bid and you don't get to form a relationship? It's low bidder. Now you can qualify that, you can have the qualifications in your contract documents, but there's no proof in the pudding until you see shop drawings. And once you see shop drawings, he's already under contract.
Yeah, so my only 2 cents. So in all my roles, I've never had a thick department. It's like me and 2 other people. And whenever we're doing projects, I find that I have to walk the job a lot more, especially if it's the first time with an integrator. And I mean, like making sure, taking a tape measure out to make sure that they've put it at the right height of the badge reader. Okay, I mean, that's, yeah, I mean, and so, you know, and I always blame me. So that conduit mistake, that was under a GC, right? We did it under a GC. The GC tightly controlled the site, didn't want anybody out there, and ruled in his contract that I can only go out there at certain times. And I caught it, you know, I blame myself for that, right? But in other cases, I'm like out there all the time whenever I get a project. And the other thing I'll do, and I know you've never seen this, where there are some integrators out there that put PM, project management time, which is nothing but pure profit margin, right? It should be, right? Right, profit margin is what it really, but yeah, but I'll hold them. Well, wait a second, and I'll get our attorneys involved. You told me there's going to be PM on the site. What's the schedule for the PM? When am I meeting the PM? What's the deal on the PM, right? And they're shocked that we hold them to that deliverable, right? Because it's all profit margin to them. So that's I don't know if that helps you, but I think if you're dealing with someone you don't know, you're going to have to either bump up your fees to count for the fact that you're going to be there, or you're going to have to eat it somewhere at the end. And one more point, it's all about your reputation, right? So, because someone will say, oh, wait a second, I chose Bob to be that consultant and the job went off the rail. When in fact, it's not Bob who went off the rail. It's the fact the way it was bid out and what the money was and all that other stuff.
Yeah, it's the whole process.
Correct.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and turn the question over to staffing. And I'll start with Mark on this. Do you ever consider the operator or management skill set limit what can be practical to design into a system? Is that taken into account in the design process and your experience? And then if you could also comment, does employee turnover affect ongoing use of the technology deployment?
I think at every system that's presented or I'm looking at, that's what I'm thinking about is can an end user, in my case the guard, use it? And or can someone on the floor use it? Is it easy for them to do? So it does take, if it's too clunky, I call it clunky, that's the really technical term for it, right? Yeah, if it's clunky, I'll steer away from it. Again, I follow my standard, is if it's Mark Powers and I have to come back to this system 3 months later to do something like find a camera, look up a record, can I do it without a lot of great training? And then I use that as my factor to say, well, a guard should be able to do that too, because I use it all the time. Employee turnover, it's huge, of course, at the contract guard business. You know, you got to factor that in. My challenge with the technology side of the business is the fact that IT has become I won't say difficult to work with. They just now think they're security experts, right? So they're going to tell you, no one has ever run into this. At one of the jobs we did, they told us the size of the network switch they were going to install. Well, it was half the power we needed, right? They made a commitment that they were only going to use half the amount of PoEs. They decided to pack and fill. So we had 48 IP cameras on a 48 PoE switch that was half the power. The fact that they don't understand security lingo and language, right, our side of the language, it just slows down the process. And then we get the black eye at the end of the day because we got a camera system on that's not delivering as promised. It took too long to get there. And oh, by the way, we're taking up bandwidth on the network that we couldn't get the IT department to give us more network space.
The first job I had in the Middle East, I sat down with the folks I was going to be working with, the design team, and started going through how we would normally start pulling things together, what the system might look like when it was done. And the security director stood up and he said, "Jim, there's something very important you've got to consider. The guards can't read." So I don't know if any of you have ever stumbled on that, but again, it goes back to that lowest common denominator. Do we overspecify sometimes because we don't look at that lowest common denominator? And I think the answer is yes. Another thing that I think that Tom should talk to relative to this whole staffing thing is how we test.
Well, I come from a Department of Energy background at the Safeguards and Security at the Y-12 nuclear weapons manufacturing facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So I spent 24 years there. So we went from being a $3.50 night watchman in 1979 to what it is today, which is a very sophisticated. I've not been there in quite some time, since the mid-1990s, but one of the things, there's a lot of discussion today about enterprise risk management, enterprise security risk management, and I'd like to replace that discussion with enterprise security performance management. And a lot of times we have all the components, but we don't really have a way to describe back to the C-suite or to the management the value all those components of a physical security program bring back to the operation. I've been on in the early days of the port security grant program. I worked with a couple of ports on the vendor selection boards. And I can't obviously get into specific names and companies and things here, but this topic of performance testing, there's acceptance testing, obviously on your all's end of the world, but on my end of the world, there's the performance testing of that against the specific threat. And in those discussions with those best and final offer 5 companies, they would not discuss that. They would not sign up to a performance testing process prior to, final, we'll just call it final payment is the best way to put it. Yeah, let me give you an example. In the Department of Energy world, there's a whole realm of, in the special nuclear material arena, there's a whole realm of, okay, however many adversaries there are, we can't go into that public forum, but they approach a fence, they begin to breach the fence, they run across the perimeter intrusion detection alarm system, they're moving into the facility, and all these things, they have a rate that they move at on foot, whether they're running, crawling, whatever. And obviously there has to be probability of detection rates that are very high there for every individual sensor in that PIDA system. Now on the private sector side, you don't see probability of detection rates many times with video analytics along a perimeter. You just say, oh, we have a video motion detection, video analytics along this 300 feet of fence line or whatever, but there's no real probabilities of detection associated with that unless you all correct me and I'm missing something.
Correctional, you do.
Yeah, and corrections you do. And, but typically in the corporate side of the world, you don't. And then there's things like pathway analysis and all the things they do within the government sector that in highly protected facilities that we don't do in the private sector. But the enterprise performance management of what these people are paying for and what they're getting, all the way down to the security officer being a part of that process. All of you raised your hand that you've been in these control rooms. You've seen the challenges and the problems, even just the basic ergonomic issues of how screens and alarm displays and how many monitors and the real truth is a $11 to $12 an hour security officer is much less expensive doing customer service. 80% of their duties are customer service versus security, weighing trucks, doing other things that have nothing to do with their security function there. But there should be some ongoing performance testing of a system by the owner of the system. But I do believe that that's something that should be talked about on the front end of what are we actually looking to detect here? What's the assessment time? How do you actually use all this when something really happens? And that's why I went back to this scenario-based approach towards what I'll call systems design, systems implementation, the whole process. Now, two things that I believe that should be included in that are what I call a root cause analysis thinking and a what-if analysis type approach. I'm sure this gentleman back here, if he does school assessments, in other words, you're thinking, why think about what could go wrong after something goes wrong? Let's implement that into our thought process on the front end. And we do a lot of that with the assessments that we do. In other words, here's the things that could go wrong, and we try to layer those things into it. Think about these performance measurement issues when we're doing some type of audit or inspection or assessment, whatever you want to call it, at a facility. But the performance testing criteria for different types of movement, different types of, entry and exit into facilities, even where you're talking about poor technicians, and I'm sure you all have seen this, you go into a facility and you go, who decided to put these cameras here? Why are they here? There's no usable information coming down to the monitor for the security officer.
No actionable.
I'm sorry, sir?
No actionable.
No, there's nothing really they can use. Nothing even of any forensic value if something happens.
How many of you have incorporated actual scenario-based testing of your security systems in acceptance test requirements?
Only in the federal market.
Only in the federal market. That's something, frankly, we should.
In correctional and in the aviation, we have to do.
It is tough to put that into the commercial sphere, but it's something that we should really consider doing because the system's not proven until it's proven under test. And so merely for us to go, yeah, the door contact works, the card reader works, the camera has a good image, really doesn't say this is going to work when the shit hits the fan. And that's the real test of the system. How many of you have been accepted when you've said to your client, I need to be the one providing your people training on what was the intent of the system and how to use it? Any?
I asked to have it pulled out of the RFP and given to us because the integrator can't do it.
Yeah, it is an important thing that we should all at least consider. You're not going to be successful. Not everybody wants to pay that extra money to you. But if we don't ask the question, they'll never buy it. And so we should be asking the question, can we provide the training? Because we're not just going to tell you what button to push, we're going to tell you why to push that button. The other aspect, how many of you have been successful after you've put it together to help them develop their true operational manual, not just the manuals provided by the manufacturer? If you're not doing that or broaching that question, you're not going to be providing a full service to your client. They may not choose to buy it, but it's something that we've got to ask.
So that takes us back to the original conversation. It's policy, procedure, and technology. They all form a triangle, just like the fire triangle. You take any one of those elements away from that triangle, and you don't have any physical security. So we always sit down in the beginning and follow a policy, what the procedures are, and if we have to adapt new procedures because of the technology we're deploying, then they need to be integrated into the procedures.
Okay. Excellent discussion. Let's switch gears and go back to training. I think earlier we identified training is a big problem area. So we've talked about it through all the topics discussed, but I want to pose the question, and Tom, maybe we can start with you. Where does training fall short? We talked a little bit about like manufacturer training means, you know, you push this button and this action takes place, but how does that not weave its way into the actual intended operation of the system? And then also, is training over time planned for, regular training? Maybe take that topic.
Well, at the plant or the facility level, from a training standpoint, whether you have a proprietary security force, whether you have a contract security force, and even first responder response training, integrating with your first responders, your drills and exercises or training or whatever the topic is you want to use. You often hear these types of you often get these types of answers. I got these answers 5 or 6 weeks ago in a facility in Illinois. Who's responsible? You know, to the security officers, tell me what your training is. So they explain to you what their training is. The facility says, well, we let the security contractor do all the training. We don't do any of the training. Well, that's a surprising answer to me, but that's the answer I got. And so the other thing is there's too much of this vagueness about training. And once again, the training is not scenario based many times. And sometimes the training is very specific to the regulation, like MITSA or CFATS or something like that. It's very specific to what the regulatory requirements are, and therefore that's all it is. And they don't think outside that regulatory box. You know, in other words, and many times the gaps I see in training are many times it's only what's required, and it's not scenario based. And with the tremendous amount of turnover sometimes you can have on the security contractor side of things, that just exasperates the problem, just makes it worse. But at the end of the day, I'm a tremendous fan of scenario-based training, taking the person all the way through what would happen and what they're supposed to do. And the regularness of training basically depends on the cost of it. It's really seems like a lot of times we've checked that box, this check the box mentality, instead of thinking, oh, it really could happen here, or something may happen that, you know, we don't want to happen here, so we don't really train for it like we should. I mean, the bottom line is it's a mindset issue. A lot of times from a management structure is we just really don't think anything will happen here. You know, that's what I see.
Let's talk real world. I get trained by the manufacturer training or the integrator's training, and I know what buttons to push, and I know how to bring up the cameras and all that. I'm going to leave. I train Tom. I'm his OJT trainer. And what he gets is what limited knowledge I remember from my training sessions and all my bad habits. Now Tom trains Mark. So Mark, that poor sucker, winds up with all my bad habits, all Tom's bad habits, and he doesn't have a clue. So, I mean, it's like, you know, telling a secret that goes around the room. By the time it gets to him, it's, you know, nowhere near where it started. And so what we ought to be thinking about doing is how do we bring into play a training program that has a lifespan to it, so that the training is going to be consistent across all of the potential operators or users of the system.
All our specifications have a training element in the execution part 3 that mandates video recording of all the training sessions so that they have a copy of the training from factory training. We also don't let vendors train, we want manufacturers to train.
So one of the things I do is we do an initial training whenever, especially we're getting a new software system in, and so we do a 4 to 8 hour block depending upon how complicated it is. The second thing we do is we let them go out and actually implement that training, and then we have a subsequent training maybe 6 months later, because they're more familiar now with the system and they know what to do. So that's one of the things we try to do. It's a fight. It's not easy to get that because you're paying guards, you know, probably time and a half, if not more, to do it. The second thing I do is what I call, and I learned this from the military side of my experience, is I'll do on-the-spot training. And what I'll do is I'll go into a command center and I'll say, hey, can you, while I'm here, guys, can you pull up camera 3232? I don't have any clue there what I'm doing. I just want to see, do they know how to pull up a camera number and look at a camera? And then I'll ask them, can you put that up on the full screen for me? Because I claim that I'm old and I can't see, which is not much of a lie. And then I'll make them do a playback because, oh, what was that? What was that? Let's see that. They don't know they're getting OJT, right? And it's all the systems that are in there. Because I may go in the room and say, hey, can you call, I need to talk to so-and-so on the radio. Can you find out where he is? And I just want to see, can they do that? Now, if they don't do it right, I don't get engaged in that. I go back and bring that back to their leadership, their supervisor says, hey, I was just up there with Charlie. Looks like Charlie's having a rough time pulling up cameras, right? And I also use that as my opportunity, especially in the pill world, to show them, anybody here in the casino business? So the pill world is just like the casino business. You watch the hands, right? And so I'm teaching them what normal hand movements look like versus, this is not a normal hand movement, this is a normal hand movement. And so I'm a little bit of an actor. But training is 24 hours a day, all the time. You got to be doing it. You got to be thinking of that.
So to Jim's point earlier on, when you were talking about how to maybe take that training effort maybe away from the integrator, in the private sector, it's hard to get the manufacturer to do it. So there's money that's on the table that you can go to the end user and say, let us train your group at the end of the project. We do the design. Let us do the training. That's a value, a service that can be provided. But a question to the floor is, how many people in here have people working for you that are certified in the systems that you guys design? Right? So that's really important. It's really important. So not only are you doing a design based on the specification from the manufacturer, you're able to go through it, parse out everything that is not important. So you can scale down the specification so it's relevant, tie that to the operational aspect, and then leverage that value-added service of being able to do the training, right? So now you're providing that full service. So that's why, Jim, I agree 100% with being able to deliver that, because I feel that the consultancy leaves that on the table over and over, and it's a perfect opportunity to kind of recoup some extra dollars, especially if they're lost in other design efforts because the project got extended or whatnot. So just the point.
May I interject for a second before you go?
Yes, sir.
I want to get hands from the floor. One of the things that we had on the list of possible reasons why our systems fail was version changes. How many of you have spec'd for your clients a non-production system where all changes are going to be tested before deployed on the production system? Yeah, if you're not thinking that way, you're thinking to failure. Because if you don't actually test those version changes on a non-production system before you move it to production, you're prone to failure.
If they don't have that production environment, I think we try to spec that into, let's try to build a test lab here because you're going to have to deal with that.
Well, a couple points. Getting back to training, the last 3 jobs I had, and they're fairly large customers, first thing that went was training. First thing, gone. Or drastically reduced from what I had. Secondly, there's a scale here. I understand what you guys a lot of talking about. You're talking about a guard force. You're talking about thing. A lot of the jobs aren't that. It's retail, like someone stated, IT, right? And they have a system administrator and maybe 1 or 2 people that they rely on as operators, which aren't necessarily security trained in any shape, form, or fashion. So I guess as what I try to insist upon with mine or work with the integrators is as a minimal, the system that was designed, that the system administrator knows how to do everything with it. And at least 1 other person, preferably as a backup if they don't have somebody watching it. But a lot of these systems we design aren't even being monitored. You know what I mean? There's nobody watching a screen, or nobody, or let me put it this way, the screen might be there with cameras on it and alarms, but no one's really watching it. You know, so but again, it's a scope. It's a difference between saying you have a guard force, regardless of what the skill set of that guard force is, versus a lot of them is an IT person or somebody, but at least they should be able to manipulate that system to bring, you know, answer alarms, do no video, record, download, at least as a minimal to that level. Yeah, when you're getting into, you know, like systems like I've done museums, I've done hospitals, you know, all that's a different level. But as a minimal, I spec a Salient system. He should be able to make sure that they can do that. And also this, and this is just another thing I was thinking, when we're thinking about specifying systems, we should kind of consider, you know, the client as far as how sophisticated that system is. I mean, there's really great systems. I don't want to go through the names, but you got your Cadillacs, and then you got one that will meet the client's needs that are very intuitive and simple, and that's really all they need. You know, and that has to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about speccing a particular access control system. What does the screen look like? It looks like Windows or what? Easy stuff, push a button, they got it. Versus, you know, you have a guard force that they can use all those bells and whistles and they can handle it. But if if you're not doing that, then I think you're over specifying.
Excellent point. It goes back to the whole end user situation. Your end user is using it for forensic analysis. And so if you've got a system where you're designing it so that it has, let's say, card holder or entry holder input, that's one thing that the system administrator will do. And then the only other thing that they'll do is after the fact analysis. We've got to be designing to that end and not designing a system with, as you said, 10,000 bells and whistles on it when you only need 2 bells and whistles. So we shouldn't be over-designing. We shouldn't be going in with a cookie-cutter approach. All of us hate that word, but how many of us go into the same job, after job, after job, after job, and you could take the same design drawings and overlay them, and it's the same freaking design. So if we're not really changing that in our thought process to how does this system really need to be configured, how is it going to be utilized, who is going to be utilizing it, what's the overall real intent of the system, then we're letting our clients down.
And that's where you can save money to get for training. You know, making a lighter system, and so then there'll be money for training at the end.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, switching gears again, this may be our last topic based on time, but the question here is, what is the most common feature or technology regularly planned into a design that ends up not being used or underutilized? Jim, do you want to start us?
Graphic maps.
Tamper switches.
Now, tamper switches I've had good luck with. Graphic maps?
Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. I think it's graphic maps. It's sold everywhere by everybody. But the challenge of it is now you have to interface with another department, right? So you got the engineering group who usually holds the PDFs or the schematics, or an outside agency. I don't think people understand the true cost of them until they've bought the system and then they realize they're not going to spend that money to do it. Third element it recently came up to a conference I went to is, believe it or not, guards are killing graphic maps because they complain about them because they do too many pop-ups. So now there's manufacturers out there making them in the background. So now it's nothing but a tab. And the guards say that the reason they want that is because they know where the cameras are, so they don't need these maps popping up anymore. So I think that's one element. I think the other elements are, I don't think the end users, so I'll just take me as an example, understand the amount of work that's going to be needed in terms of data entry, right? So when you go to these shows, it all looks pretty and sweet. Like we always call it, we made the magic happen. I always say, oh, it's just magic. People don't realize it was probably 30 steps I took to make that magic happen to them, right? So you have 30 steps from one alarm point, and you've got 1,500 alarm points, You do the math. You're going to be spending 2 weeks doing nothing but programming, right? And most people just stop doing it after a while. So I think that's kind of the two things I see: graphics and anything that requires a lot of detailed programming. People just stop doing it because they realize they just don't have the time to do it. I also think what other thing people don't utilize these systems for, and I'm thinking about the school situation, right? So being creative of how to use input outputs and links. And people don't take it the other way and say, hey, I got this great powerful tool. So I was thinking about the shooting. I'm not going to solve the design, but what if you put a badge reader, right, in everyone's classroom? Since you're pulling cable there anyways, right? What's it cost to pull some more cable? You slap a badge reader up, and that's your emergency badge reader. Every teacher has a badge that, right, they can work that badge reader. They hit that badge reader, and what that does is that generates an automatic sound, an alert, right? There comes the visual message. All the way, you can open doors, whatever you want to do, open doors, close doors. There's so much to do with these systems that just don't get applied elsewhere in other applications. And the problem is they don't have really smart people helping them to think that way, right? So, we just got to be a little more broader with our vision of some of these technologies.
Mark brought up an excellent point. Again, to you guys, how many of you really go over with your client the administrative load that the system bears? Because folks who don't understand that they've just bought into a system where they need to have a full-time system administrator, and maybe a couple of them, you've lost the mark. They need to know the operational implications of your design. Otherwise, again, their system is going to fail because they don't have the manpower to support that.
Okay, excellent points. We have time for one more question, I think, which relates to this. And Jim, I'll start with you because I believe this was a question you had proposed. What can technology providers do to make systems more usable for the consumer security goals?
I think the first thing is probably the first question that I asked everybody in the room was, are the manufacturers sitting at that $12 an hour guard desk so that they know what the system that they're designing is winding up at the lowest common denominator? And quite a number of you aren't. And so if you as manufacturers are not looking at the lowest common denominator, you're probably over-designing the system.
Excellent point.
I'd have to agree with what Jim said, and probably more of an emphasis on training at that level also, or preparing the facility to train those people properly.
I'll take a little different approach to it. I think it's installer quality a little bit. Too often I see what happens in my field is we get the product and we're under the impression that they're going to be doing the install, and they end up subbing it out, that subs it out, right? Anyone ever built a house and you get the roughing guys who goof it all up and then they have to hire someone to go fix all the goof ups? Well, in our world, that just sets us behind, right? So I think if you're, and again, I come from more of a brand protection, right? So that's your brand. I don't care what it is, right? And I won't mention any names, but we know all the brands that are out there. And if you don't have some good people installing your brand and it doesn't work the way your brand is designed, then you're doing your brand a disservice, right? So you need to do a tighter control. I'll give you a real-world example. I never thought this was happening at this point in my career. I'm told that I have to use this particular vendor to put in a camera system. I'm very familiar with this camera system. I could probably go sell the stuff because I know all the goods and bads and things about it, right? I find out the guy's not certified, but he thinks he can go install this system, and he has no clue about the challenge he's going to run into at the NVR level, right? And if you don't get the NVR right, you're not going to get the cameras right. So I have to be making a phone call when I get back to say, hey, are you guys aware he's not qualified to do this? So I put it right there. If it starts off with that level, it's going to go bad, and go bad fast.
Okay, great points. We're going to wrap it up right here, and let me turn it over to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for the panel? No other questions? Okay, well, I want to say thank you to our panelists and thank you everybody for coming in to participate. Really appreciate it.